Last week, Facebook's co-founder Chris Hughes called for the breakup of the social networking giant. Hughes making that call in the New York Times in an op-ed that he wrote. He talked about the controversial statement in Mark Zuckerberg's power with Kate Snow of NBC News.
Do you think Facebook is dangerous?
I do. The reason that I'm speaking out is because I think Facebook has become too big, too powerful. He is extremely powerful because he has no boss, because there's no regulatory agency.
Join us right now to tell us why Facebook should not be broken up. As a former high-level official at the company, Chris Kelly is the former Facebook chief privacy officer, and he was the company's first general counsel. He also represented Netscape in its antitrust lawsuit against Microsoft back in 2001. And we thank you for joining us this morning, Chris.
Thanks so much for having me.
You don't like the breakup argument. Tell us why.
So antitrust law is ultimately a really, really blunt instrument, and you have to justify a number of different steps in terms of monopolization, attempted monopolization, monopoly maintenance, and none of those criteria are met here. It's not even clear that Facebook has a monopoly in any relevant market. People talk about social networking, but that's not a defined antitrust market. We're talking about telecommunication services, messaging services, online advertising. Facebook isn't the #1 player in any of those markets, so it's hard to imagine a court ever thinking anything seriously about an antitrust argument about breaking it up.
Okay, let me ask you a separate question. Do you see the problems that Chris Hughes laid out in that there is a remarkable amount of power that Mark Zuckerberg has, and whether that power should be checked one way or the other?
So ultimately, there has to be accountability for every company, and I think that Facebook is accepting that and devoting millions of dollars of resources and some of the brightest minds on the planet to addressing problems of election interference, problems of hate speech online. When we set the standards, I've been out of the company for 10 years now, but when we set the standards on hate speech early on, we knew that there would be problems eventually. The scale at which this operates right now it was hard to imagine. But ultimately, the company is investing very, very heavily in these, and breaking up the company would hurt that, not help it. Okay, so is there a market? Do you believe that there's a market mechanism to keep Facebook in check, whatever that means? Or would you competition, which is counseled by the laws?
But the other question is, given some of the regulatory questions in Washington. And even the way we regulate, by the way, banks in the United States, and I don't know if you consider Facebook to have the sort of size and power of a bank and want to consider it a utility, but there are regulators now who literally sit inside banks in America. Do you think there should be regulators sitting inside of a Facebook?
I don't think it should go that far, because one of the things that when I represented Netscape in the Microsoft antitrust trial, the worry was that Microsoft was constraining innovation. Facebook's not constraining innovation in any way. There's all sorts of different ways that people are competing every day, that you see TikTok, you see a number of these different apps sort of get deep penetration quickly. You have, a larger player in online advertising in Google. You have a larger player in messaging like Apple. All of these, companies should be competing. That's what the antitrust laws are ultimately about.
So, Chris, when you were there 9 years ago, is Chris Hughes involved at all in anything going on?
No, Chris, I consider Chris a friend, and I was a little bit surprised at the way that he's taken this.
So what do you think happened, by the way?
I don't understand the motivation there. I mean, I'm glad he was involved with founding it, because, Kate Snow and anybody else is going to listen to anything he says, but I'm not sure his opinions about this are any more relevant than mine, just because he was there at the beginning. I don't know why all of a sudden we have to jump and say how high on the way up when he wants universal basic income or 90% marginal tax rates or any of the stuff that he decides to opine on now.
Chris took an extensive role in product in the early part of the company. He was a major contributor, but it's not clear that he's sort of got the right prescription in any way to address the problems that the company's identified.
What would you do? To the extent you think there's a problem, what would you do?
Well, I think that the engagement that the company is undergoing right now was something that we did in the early days when it was something that could have killed the company. We talked about safety standards online. We talked about fighting sexual predators online. We worked with regulators regularly. And now the company is deeply re-engaged with that. Mark was over meeting with President Macron in France. You've got a whole bunch of engagement that he's done with this kind of civil society community, talking about what the future needs to look like here. And that's the path that it should continue. It's not like you're not getting any executive attention or throughout the company attention on these issues. It's a breakup would hurt that, not help it. Hurt the idea that we need to address these issues.
Final question for you, Chris, but it's an antitrust one, and it's not about Facebook. It's actually about the others, which is there have been arguments made about whether Google should be broken up. I'd be curious what you think there. There's a recent argument to be made that Elizabeth Warren's making about Apple, whether you want to separate the App Store, for example, from Apple itself. You can go down the list. Amazon. Do you think that any of these companies have too much market share right now?
So when platforms sort of appear in an area and when you get to a major domination of any given platform, I think that you have to look at the possibility of structural ideas about how to promote competition in those areas. But I don't think any of these companies are at a point where somebody with a different platform kind of can't go after them in any meaningful way. It's always a hard question you have to point to particular problems where a market's being constrained in order to justify any sort of relief under the antitrust laws. And I haven't seen a theory really develop in any of those companies at this point that could justify that under existing law. Now, I do think that you always have to watch about concentrations of corporate power, and the roots of the antitrust laws and the progressive movement are very, very significant factors in the history of the company, and we should worry about bigness as it applies to harming consumers and harming people throughout the ecosystem. But you've got to meet a pretty high bar to get to any sort of true structural remedy, and we're just not anywhere close to that yet.